want to start off by asking a very simple question. Have any of you wondered why or how our towns and cities are planned? You know, for example, why South Windsor High School is here in this location, or why Town Hall is right down the street, or why Stop and Shop is just right around the corner. It's down to planning and zoning, and why it has occurred, well, we're going to be talking about that. So zoning, I'm not going to read it for speech, but essentially zoning is essentially saying, over here I'd like some commercial, over here I'd like some residential. In our downtown, maybe make it a little bit more dense. And over here near the highway, let's have some warehouses and industrial, so truck traffic can have an easy access to the highway. That is making land use essentially, and it's essentially zoning. Zoning is allocating certain plots of land for certain uses, and it's essentially what we're here to talk about today. Unfortunately, zoning does have some consequences, but first, there are some positives that you want to talk about. So, the benefits of early zoning, of why it was invented, or at least introduced, is really during the Industrial Revolution, of course. During the Industrial Revolution, you had a lot of warehouses and factories that came up, and of course, during this time, a lot of nuisances were created. For example, pollution and health standards, they're located too close to houses. So of course, something had to be done, and of course, early regulations actually helped people when it came to putting in correct zoning policies to create barriers or buffers, for example, in between industrial and residential, for example. However, zoning does have some drawbacks and consequences. First of all, even without zoning, there are still some consequences. The very first zoning regulations were brought forward in New York City. In New York City, of course, you can see how tall these skyscrapers are. And of course, in New York City, they didn't have regulations prior to 1916. It was when the Inequitable building was constructed that it was too tall and there was nothing meant to make sure light got to the ground level, to the street. It was to the point where you were not casting a shadow because the building above you was casting a shadow. So New York City had the first zoning regulations implemented. Of course, if I point up here, you can see as the buildings got taller, you can see it would narrow up. So hence why the Empire or Chrysler building, they would narrow as you got towards the top. However, there are some consequences when it came to zoning. Some developers and town planners saw it as an avenue to discriminate not only against minorities, but to keep people separated from one another. In 1916 as well, Berkeley, California was the first city that introduced single-family zoning. Single-family zoning is essentially most of the houses that we live in. You know, they're detached, they're singular, with a plot of grass and land around you. That is single-family zoning, the typical house that you live in. It was created by Duncan McDuffie, and essentially the thought process behind it was, back then in Berkeley, a lot of the homes that people lived in were apartments and condos and stuff like that. It was deemed as an avenue of affordability. However, on the contrary, single-family zoning has always been, or at least trying to buy a house that is in a single-family zone, has always been a bit more expensive, if we would. Depending down either down payments or trying to rent from it, it really comes down to the amount of land that you get in a house. So it is with the plot of land that it becomes more expensive and inequality starts to arise. So Duncan McDuffie created single-family zoning as a set time to make sure, and not only that, but to divide people from one another. Like I said, if you wanted to live in a single-family house, it costed a lot more money than it did to live in an apartment. And at the time, in the early 1900s, white people had a lot more wealth when it came to minorities and people of color, and this policy effectively worked. A lot of people, and a lot of white people left cities and towns to move into these single-family houses. And so I want to mention the next case, of course, like I said, single-family zoning. As you can see, singular detached homes, and Duncan McDuffie was a product of it. He was a developer in Berkeley, and he's the one that wanted to divide the city. So in 1922, a lot of people saw zoning becoming a thing. So in 1922, the Commerce Department and Herbert Hoover, who before he was president, headed up the project to introduce zoning nationwide, making sure every town and city has a chance take up zoning. For the most part, it allowed towns to create planning and zoning commissions, which I serve on one of them, but also it allowed towns to really explore avenues to protect their citizens from nuisances. The consequence of creating this act, there's many positives, but we're going to highlight some of the negative impacts and where to go from there. So I also want to highlight that this act was challenged. Around 1922, it was Euclid, Ohio, the little township in Ohio, that challenged against Ambler Realty. They owned 68 acres of land. When zoning was introduced in Euclid, it disproportionately affected Ambler Realty with their lots of land, so they sued the town, and on a lower federal court, they decided, you know what, you're right, Ambler. It is unconstitutional for zoning to be a thing. So they brought it to the Supreme Court, and guess what? The Supreme Court decided that Euclid, Ohio was right, and that zoning should be allowed, and it's constitutional. So I want to talk about the first racist practice, really, of zoning of it being in effect. Austin, Texas, they had a city plan. In 1928, they chose to move most of their minority citizens living in the town and move them towards East Austin. East Austin, 90% of their industrial lots are in, of course, East Austin. If you live in industrial, of course, with warehouses and factories, it's deemed undesirable. It's sort of where the communities get less resources for schools and roads, and we're going to be talking about that next. So essentially, they are starting to segregate by design. Next, we have redlining, which is something that I hope all of us are somewhat aware of. During the 1930s now that zoning is legal, many towns and cities across the country decided that redlining was a good practice to put in use to decide which areas and communities and boroughs got funding over other communities. So if I highlight up here, you see all the red and the yellow, those are communities deemed undesirable. Whereas the little green and blue corner over here, those are more desirable communities. If you match it with the chart over here, we have Polish and Jewish people and Germans, a lot of minorities in Brooklyn here this is. A lot of them match up with the red and yellow areas. And so we look at a map now of modern day Brooklyn. A lot of highways going through our sort of poor neighborhoods are deemed undesirable neighborhoods. This is done on purpose. When these highways were constructed in the 40s and the 50s, they chose purposely to make sure to demolish homes and deemed in these red and yellow areas. And if you'll notice that this highway here, it curves right when it gets to that green spot. It curves and it goes around because that is the most desirable part of Brooklyn, and they chose not to destroy it. And of course, in center Brooklyn, no highways were constructed because it's mainly blue. I also want to talk about, of course, the American dream concept. The American dream concept is very simple. Get yourself a house, get yourself a car, of course, maybe even a boat if you got enough money for it, but also single-family zoning. It returns. And it was deemed, again, if you wanted to live in one of these nice, fancy houses away from the city slums, it costed quite a bit of money. And again, that is what sort of caused the white flight that caused a lot of white people to move to suburbs. It is the concept, really, of Levittown, Pennsylvania, which is one of the first cities to do this on purpose. And again, it was meant to sort of segregate our communities by race to make sure our cities stayed one way and bring more upper class and middle class people that could afford it to move out into the suburbs. But also when this happened, there were a lot of communities that decided car-centric centers, for example, were the way to go. This is at the same time that the automobile industry lobbied the government to try and penalize penalize pedestrians from sharing the road with cars. As I point out at the very bottom here, jaywalking is a ridiculous term created to sort of punish people and stigmatize people for crossing the road illegally. California recently just got rid of jaywalking, so you can cross the road whenever you want in California. But as you can see here, you used to be able to share the road with cars. There were no need for sidewalks because the road was the sidewalk. Cars had to maneuver around people and make sure nobody got hit. The automobile industry wanted people to buy cars and so forth. Our community was designed around roads, as you can see here, and highway expansions and widening highways. And for example, if you ever wanted to cross the street, this is sort of what it felt like. You had to stay between the lines, making sure you don't fall over, or in this case, don't get hit by a car. But I also want to talk about the increased use of parking lots and, of course, strip malls. A lot of downtowns, and you wonder why South Windsor doesn't have this right now. For the longest time, South Windsor was zoned to not have a downtown or a city center. No really commercial was pushed to the road. Now, luckily, we have a town center overlay zone that really allows for future development. If there's development that occurs there, downtown to push all these commercial buildings right up to the road, as you can see sort of here. But at the time in the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of undesirable buildings were torn down for parking lots. Again, a car-centric society. I also want to talk about minimum lot sizes. These are used to discriminate, again, against people of a lower class that can't afford to buy a lot of 2.5 acres. A lot of towns across Connecticut have a minimum lot size of maybe an acre, or maybe even 2 acres. Imagine that. You want to build it and live in a nice tiny house. It requires at least 2 full acres to live in a singular lot. Imagine how much upkeep that's going to be. Imagine how much that's going to cost. It's a lot of money. And it was, again, an indirect way to segregate our communities, not only by race, but by wealth and class as well. Also, and finally, I do want to talk about what's happening today in Connecticut. This is actually Woodbridge, Connecticut, believe it or not. This is actually one of the flyers that went out a while ago about a multi-family development that had a couple units in there. Very simple. It blended right into what Woodbridge was, and people opposed it, as you can see, at their local planning and zoning public hearing. It happens all the time. Even if it's not housing, it's warehouses. A lot of people will file up and get together, and they'll be opposed to a project, and sometimes they'll be labeled as NIMBY, or not in my backyard. It is a very common term when residents pour together and unite and go to public hearings and speak against projects. I think Dave Chappelle even did this year against residential developments in the city that he lives in. So how can we plan for a better tomorrow? Unfortunately, a lot of negative things have happened in the past when planning and zoning for cities. There is a lot that we can do. We can learn from our mistakes, and we can push forward for inclusionary zoning. What we saw prior, that was exclusionary zoning. It was separating and segregating our communities. So first and foremost, some cities across the country have banned single-family zoning, or at least the classification of it. Minneapolis has done it recently, and even Berkeley, California, the birth of single-family zoning, has now banned it recently. And of course, California, again, is making an initiative to do that. Also, I want to talk about the economics of density for some of you that are scared about multifamily developments. As you can see here, and this is a very good graph to show what's going on, a lot of the poorer neighborhoods in a city, and this, for example, is Lafayette, Louisiana. What's going on here is a lot of the mansions and the single-family houses are really, for the tax dollar in the city, it's not working out. For what's making on, the use of land, it's efficient for what's going on downtown. You can see it up here in Eugene, Oregon. A lot of downtowns and malls and stuff like that, buildings that are being built on the outskirts, you can see is not profitable. And of course, on the bottom right, you have, again, the outskirts of Minneapolis. Right here, you can see how profitable it is for sort of multifamily developments, big buildings, anything like that. Of course, on the outskirts, very low, no profits at all. So it's more profitable for a city or a town to embrace change, embrace multifamily developments or sort of taller buildings than single family. It's just more profitable and it works for everyone. So I mentioned mixed-use zoning, essentially. And so I also want to talk about what these two terms mean. Single-family zoning is essentially saying, I want residential here, I want commercial here. They shall not intermingle. However, with mixed use, that changes. Because as you can see in the bottom, you have commercial, maybe on the first floor of a shop. Then above it, you have some residential. You see this a lot in some towns. But for the most part, across the country, it's been outlawed for such a long time. The concept of having mixed-use zoning for towns has been outlawed for the most part. And it's been more affordable for people to live in these mixed-use settings. It's been more affordable. Think about it. It's been done that on purpose. It's been designed by segregation to keep communities separate. I also want to talk about, well, if you're not a fan of development or density and stuff like that, let's talk about something a little bit less radical, if you will. There's a missing middle. Of course, in South Windsor, we have two types of housing. We have our single family, like we talked about. But if you've ever been to Evergreen Walk, you have the Temple apartments, which we could classify as sort of the bigger apartments. However, there's a type of housing that goes in the middle. Again, that has been outlawed in America, and mainly no other countries. So for example, duplexes, triplexes, courtyards, townhomes. For the most part, those are also more affordable to build and also result in cheaper living, allow for affordability. And again, these have been outlawed for such a long time. In South Windsor, you're only ever going to see single-family houses. So it's really interesting to see what has been going on. And of course, in South Windsor, we've changed that approach, and we're looking forward to the future. So you also have a chance of transit-oriented development. This is actually pretty good for the environment, because think about it. In Connecticut this year, we had a proposal of transit-oriented development. It essentially means prioritizing and incentivizing housing within transit stops, maybe a fast track station. So what that essentially does is not only is it, again, you're adding more homes, so it's a bit more affordable because you're increasing the supply, but also you're putting homes closer towards transit destinations. People are more likely to use the metro or the fast track bus to go to work or to shop, for example, or visit friends. It gets cars off the road, and it goes back to the point that we can plan our cities better for everyone. Cities that work for everyone. Like I said, people over cars. Think about it. Back in the 1900s, when the automobile industry lobbied the government and did so very, very well, the priority for people fell off the roof. You had to be penalized if you cross the street illegally. And here, this is different. We should be designing our cities and towns people over cars. A society of people over cars includes protected bike lanes or prioritized bus lanes where people can carpool and there's less cars on the road. Also, I'd also like to talk about walking to your shop, for example. All the stores are pushed together closer to the road. And again, like we said, how much priority of protected bike lanes. It protects everyone. These communities should be not only helping us, but benefiting us and protecting us. It's about protecting people. Because again, it's people over cars. Last but not least, I also want to talk about what we can do in our community, in South Windsor and in Connecticut. So in Connecticut this year, we had a proposal for fair rent commissions. It passed. So South Windsor is eventually going to get a fair rent commission. It allows people to challenge unfair rent increases to this commission and decide whether or not it was unfair or unconscionable, and see whether or not your rent should actually be raised. It's a good platform. Quentin Williams was the chair of the Housing Committee and pushed this bill forward, and it got passed. Also, every town should have an affordable housing plan. Unfortunately, less than half in Connecticut do. They have 4 years to develop a plan. Luckily in South Windsor, we passed ours unanimously, and it gives us a guide. It gives us a vision to push forward and how to achieve more affordable housing, how to get that 10%, and how to achieve anyone who wants to live in South Windsor can move to South Windsor. So what should we take away from this? There are 3 key ideas I want to leave with you today. The first is, it doesn't have to be this way, right? We talked about what, for example, Berkeley, California has done. We talked about what Austin, Texas has done, moving people across the town just to maintain segregation. And it's interesting because even communities in the north decided to do segregation by design. They didn't have to segregate people through drinking fountains from black and white. No, they decided to do it indirectly by changing their zoning policies to move people around indirectly. It doesn't have to be this way. There's so much that we can do in terms of inclusionary zoning, having affordable components required in our developments to make sure this is a community for everyone. We also, like I said, we can plan for a better tomorrow. Prioritize safety for everyone. Communities that prioritize people over cars. Last but not least, be adaptive to change. When change happens right next door to your house, for example, it may be a little scary. But when it comes to new housing developments, when it comes to bringing new people into town, or whether or not it's all the things that get built in your community, be adaptive to change. It's for the better. A lot of people want to move into, for example, South Windsor. We have a bunch of brand new schools. We're one of the biggest towns bustling with new people coming in. So I leave you with this. Be adaptive to change. It's for the better. And that is what I would like to leave with everyone today.